that's not something that I would say that he carried on doing consistently at all. But it's very interesting that he struck upon that very early on. You know, he was making his records in a way that was far more sophisticated than most people were making records at that time. I don't think he was the first either, in fact. I mean, Frank Sinatra made LPs as LPs when he made those records with Nelson Riddle in the wee small hours of the morning and Come Fly With Me and so on, you know, sort of thematic LPs. So the idea that nobody made art LPs until the mid-60s, I think, was always a bit misleading anyway. So I think all of that stuff still stands in the book. There's one big element at the beginning of the book which I felt, looking back on it, that I never quite completed, and that was a sort of an argument, a thesis about folk, and how folk, the idea of folk, the concept of folk, had shaped Dylan. I think it shaped him both when he was a folk artist, obviously, but it also shaped the whole confrontational drama that he got into and perpetuated about going electric and those kind of very theatrical, he made those sort of happening type concerts where he kept confronting people with this sort of conflict of electric and folk, or pop and folk, or and that was shaped by the idea of folk that he grew up in. So I started the book with this sort of investigation into folk and what was folk, what did people mean by folk, and where had the idea of folk come from. But I felt in the book, and one of the reasons I'd like to do a second edition of the book, apart from the fact that there's quite a lot more material since 2001, one thing I'd really like to do in a second edition is kind of bring that argument full circle, because I felt I sort of followed it halfway around an arc and never quite arrived at its conclusion. So to recap that a bit, that thesis, folk is embedded right in the beginning of the Romantic movement. And all the early English Romantics, Wordsworth and Coleridge, relied on folk, based a lot of what they did on folk, on the ballad form, and also on the idea of what, you know, Wordsworth called, what is the phrase, Jeff? The real language spoken by men. This idea that he was writing a sort of a folk poetry, but they'd already inherited that idea from the German Romantics, and in fact we call it folk because that's what the German scholars of the second half of the 18th century called it. Their investigations were into folk, and that was part of German nationalism, if you like, the idea to seek a German national identity was to look, well, what is it that makes us a people? Let's look into folk. And in German there are all sorts of compound nouns which we don't have: folk story, folk dance, you know, so on. And we call it folk song, really, because that's what the German scholars called it. And that influence, I think, carried on, runs all the way through Romanticism. It keeps popping up. Again, it pops up in Yeats, the idea of the folk soul. You know, that he would be nourished by the Irish folk soul. But it became complicated. I mean, that idea had a lot of ideals attached to it. It had both, you know, aesthetic ideals attached to it. It came to have political ideals attached to it, especially in America in the 1930s and 1940s, which was the period that really shaped the culture that Dylan came up in. But if you look at the ideals of folk as they were laid out by English folk scholars around the turn of the century, people like Cecil Sharp, and there's a woman called Maud Carpelese, who was who went with Cecil Sharp on song collecting trips to the Appalachians, southern United States, looking for preserved remnants of the British folk tradition in the Appalachians. She wrote a book called An Introduction to English Folk Song, which is a very sort of pure statement of the ideals of what folk music was. And I'll quote you a bit of it from the book, just to give you an idea. She says about folk music, it is impersonal because it is the expression of the community and not merely of the individual. It is sincere but because it has been evolved unconsciously. I thought that was a very interesting ideal, really. The idea that the folk are in some way the unconscious of society, and that's a romantic idea as well. The romantics, in the face of the oncoming Industrial Revolution, looked back, if you like, or tried to preserve something, a connection with something more primitive, and they characterised it, it was something that was back or down from where they were, so it can be down into the unconscious mind, back into childhood, back to a rural, a pastoral past, and it was felt that the folk in some way embodied this. They were so in a sense the city and urban culture was the conscious, the superego of society, and the folk were its unconscious. But it's a sort of problematic idea when you think about it, because the folk are no more unconscious than anybody else. They don't walk around in a trance. And it's fair to assume that the people who created folk songs created them in the same way that anybody else created a song. That the song started with somebody making a song. Some person made a song. I mean, people didn't just walk around in the village green throwing lines at each other and suddenly there was a song. So in fact, although they're lost in the mists of time, we have to suppose that there are individual artists there originally. Now what they created may have been modified as it passed through oral transmission, but I don't see that there's fundamentally any difference between them and any other artists. But folk came to represent this kind of purity, but it wasn't contaminated by the ego. It wasn't contaminated by commercialism either, which is also problematic, because in fact there's been a constant interplay between commerce and folk art all through the creation of folk art. There were people producing ballads, printing them, and then going out into the country and selling them. And some of those people were professional songwriters sitting in garrets in London, producing, if you like, pastiche versions of songs about jolly ploughboys and shepherds and shepherdesses.